I'm Emily Friedland, Vice President of Clinical Research at DCN Dx, and this is Expert Insight. Today, we're talking about FDA's Quality Management System Regulation, or QMSR, and what it means if you develop or manufacture IVDs. As of February 2nd, 2026, QMSR is in effect. It incorporates ISO 13485-2016 by reference into 21 CFR Part 820, and among other changes, it comes with an updated inspection approach that changes what FDA investigators can request and review during a facility visit. I have two guests with me today. One comes from the regulatory strategy side and one from the quality systems implementation side. First, Dan Simpson, Director of Regulatory Affairs at DCN Dx. Dan works with IVD developers and manufacturers on FDA regulatory strategy and quality system readiness. He recently published an article on QMSR readiness that we'll be drawing on throughout this episode. And joining us on the pod for the first time, Kevin Gunning, Principal Consultant at Gunning Quality Systems LLC. Kevin has spent over 25 years building and managing quality systems at IVD and medical device companies. He's an ASQ certified quality auditor and has extensive firsthand experience on both sides of FDA and ISO audits and inspections. Dan, Kevin, welcome.
Thanks, Emily. As always, nice to chat with you.
Great to be here. Thanks, Emily.
Let's get started. Dan, let's start with a clean definition for anyone still getting oriented. What is QMSR? What did it change from legacy quality system regulation? And what does it mean for an IVD manufacturer day to day?
The QMSR is the Quality Management System Regulation, which replaces the previous quality system regulation. It is still codified under 21 CFR Part 820. But what the difference is that it incorporates by reference the majority of ISO 1345, which is the quality management system standard internationally for medical devices. What it means for IVD manufacturers day to day is that if you currently operate under 1345, it's not going to be a big operational change, but there are some key differences that manufacturers have to pay attention to and some traps that could potentially occur if you don't really go through a gap assessment and make sure you're transitioning properly. If you don't operate under 1345, there's going to be more substantive changes, especially around risk management.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Kevin, from a quality systems implementation standpoint, how does this land for a team that's been running a well-maintained ISO 13485 system? What's the practical difference they're going to feel?
So for a company that has a well-maintained ISO 13485 system, the transition should be fairly painless, more of an evolution than a revolution or a big change. But it's not automatic, and there needs to be some work done to demonstrate, within ISO 13485, you're required during your management review to assess how changes like this to the regulatory environment impact the business and make plans. And you should be able to demonstrate that management is aware of the transition, that you've done a gap analysis, and that you've mapped the FDA specific portions of oversight into your 13485 based system. Most companies operating in the US have already done that because it's part of the regulatory landscape that they work in. So again, it should be, if you're running things the way you should be running things, you should have already been planning for this, seeing that this transition was coming and putting together a plan to make sure that you are compliant with the new FDA expectations.
It sounds like it should be pretty painless for people who are already working under 13485, but what's the most common mistake or assumption that you see teams making about the QMSR that could be just completely wrong?
Well, I think the most common assumption is, we're 13485 certified, so we're fine. I mean, not all ISO certifications are created equal to begin with, depending on how you certified or how you claim to be compliant. But the difference is that there's real teeth to people coming in and inspecting you now. And so whereas ISO 13485 for a lot of companies was almost something to put on the website or a certification for satisfying people doing supplier qualifications on them, et cetera. Now it's part of the actual FDA requirements and inspection practice, so that the old QSIT inspection, quality system inspection techniques are out the window, and it's more of an ISO 13485 based inspection. And some of the things that were off limits in previous inspections, like your internal audits, management reviews, complaints, responses to those things are now reviewable by FDA. And in practice, that shouldn't change how you document those things. But in reality, it does change how you would approach that in certain ways. And there are strategies that can help you make sure that you don't write yourself into a corner, or that you're following your own procedures. So the scoping of those types of internal records that used to be off limits to FDA now need to be looked at and written up with the lens that FDA may be looking at these.
And in your article, you lay out 3 practical realities that matter right now for IVD manufacturers under QMSR. Can you walk us through them?
Yeah, sure. And there are things that Kevin has already mentioned aptly. And of course, the quality plan is one thing that Kevin already mentioned. And really the point, I think, that he said really well is that you should be treating this like all changes to your quality system. And you should show the regulators and the auditors that just because there's a perceived sameness here between 1345 and the QMSR, you should treat it like it's a change, which it is. So you do that by doing a quality plan and then conducting that gap assessment, and then finally getting that approval by your management review team that you're ready to go. And then again, as Kevin mentioned as well, one of the points I made was that now there's certain records, management review minutes, audit reports that are now available for FDA review. If you weren't already writing those documents to be viewed by auditors and regulators, you probably should have been. And now there's no hiding from it.
Kevin, on the point of the quality plan being signed by management, you've built systems from the ground up at several organizations. What does it look like to put together a quality plan that management will sign with confidence and that provides evidence of readiness to an outside investigator?
It should be very practical. We're not looking for a 100-page theoretical assessment. It should be kind of 4 points. What did we assess? What gaps did we find? What did we do about those gaps? And how do we know that the system is now working? So a follow-up. So what you want to see is an effectiveness check at the end of the plan. I think where people run into problems is if you're doing a management review, and I see this there in the field where it's sort of a check the box management review, a standing agenda. There's not a lot of updates to the quality objectives or action items. So if your quality system is working and the management review process is working, you should see that this change was identified, a plan was put together, objectives maybe were updated to say we're going to add this to our quality objectives for the year to make sure that we've updated our QMS for this change, the gaps and the assignments, and then within the plan itself, a general schedule, just like any other project. What were the gaps? Assign the tasks out to fill those gaps, follow up to make sure that they are filled, and then maybe build it into your audit plan to demonstrate that you're following up to make sure that each one of those identified gaps has been filled and is functioning correctly at the end of the plan execution.
Regarding the QMSR specific content for that quality plan, can you describe what's new compared to the 13485 management review package? And what does the U.S. regulatory overlay add?
I think it's just important to think about the FDA regulatory requirements that FDA has really pulled out of ISO and has said is important to them in the new final rule for this QMSR, that your systems for complaint handling, adverse event reporting, MDRs, and recalls, UDI, those kind of things are really still defined very well within that ISO framework. And then really, I think it's still just driven by what Kevin said. It's driven by your gap assessment. It's It's driven by the new definitions also put forth by ISO compared to the QSR. And really just making sure your system is easy to maneuver for an auditor or an inspector as well.
Moving on to places where people may find gaps in their systems. Your article described 4 areas where those gaps tend to cluster, even for companies that have well-maintained 13485 systems. Let's go through them now. The first is applicable to regulatory requirements, UDI, MDR obligations, corrections, and removals. What does it mean to have those integrated into the QMS versus handled in a parallel regulatory workflow?
Well, first of all, there really shouldn't be parallel regulatory workflows, as Kevin would probably agree. Everything should go through the quality system. All regulatory requirements should be directed through SOPs, and governing SOPs should refer to the appropriate regulatory SOPs. Things like UDI and MDR and correction removals are requirements of ISO 1345. But they're very general. It says where UDIs are required by a regulatory body, you should follow them. What the QMSR does is says specifically where to reference these requirements and that these requirements must be there to the detail that FDA wants. And same with MDR, corrections and removals, reporting to regulatory authorities, but then you just need to put in the specific requirements through the Part 803 and Part 807, which is MDR and corrections and removals, respectively.
Kevin, adding to this, what does the integration look like procedurally? When you're auditing or building a QMS, how do you tell whether MDR decision-making is genuinely embedded versus just referenced?
ISO 13485 is an international standard, so you may be reporting to multiple agencies, and of course the US FDA is mostly concerned that you report things to them. So what you want to see is specific instructions for how things are handled and reported to FDA, right from any of the feeder systems that end up generating reportable events, so primarily complaints, and you want to see that the decision-making for reportability is built right into the complaint management procedure, and that the folks making those decisions are qualified to make them. The timing of requirements are controlled. So I want to see the links to the CAPA, the risk management, the corrections and removals processes. Typically, I'd like to see a regulatory affairs personnel sign off on those procedures. We want to see that there's a mechanism for trending, especially for complaints. If multiple incidents of the same type of complaint come in, they may be small, but you need to be able to have a system in place where you're doing a management review or a roll-up or trending of those complaints so that you can recognize that just by frequency, some of these things may become larger issues and get referred to CAPA or assessed for reportability. And then especially for IVDs, this can get tricky for maybe not a physical injury, not a lot of those type of risks, but false negatives, false positives, invalids that delay results. These things can impact patient safety just as much as, something that physically touches the patient. So we want to see that those are being assessed and monitored for trending as well. A good test is to walk through some real complaints, look at how the decisions are being made. Usually, are they being bucketed? Are they being trended? Can you see when an issue is fed into a CAPA? Is there connection between the two systems? These are the types of where the rubber meets the road type of, systematic implementations of complaints management into the reportability that we want to see. The systems are designed to work together, and there's really good tools out there to make them work together these days. So we want to see that folks are exercising those systems and documenting clearly in the records that, the correct decisions are being made, Chanel to back them up.
Right. Dan, Kevin just touched on the second point from your article around complaint handling records. Anything to add around what the QMSR requires in those records and anything that teams might be missing?
One of the biggest compliance issues FDA usually has, you see the most 43s is off of the complaint system. And that just shows you how important, from an FDA perspective, complaint handling is. So I think this is the one area where FDA has really kept the verbiage of the original quality system regulation, because to them, this is the most important thing. And it really goes around properly identifying the complaint in the product that is associated with it and doing an investigation or justifying when there is no investigation why you didn't do one. And then, as Kevin also said, getting that into your data analysis, CAPA procedures, and then also connecting to MDRs and correction and removals. So it really goes back to just their fundamental regulatory requirements. There's a lot of identification that I'm not going to go through, but that's really the gist of it. They've really kept their compliance part of this because to them, ISO alone didn't really satisfy their needs.
The third area for gaps that was identified in your article is labeling and packaging controls. Dan, the article adds an IVD specific element here that goes beyond the general device labeling regulation, conformance to 21 CFR Part 809. Can you explain what that adds for IVD manufacturers specifically?
I really put that in because I think a lot of my clients that are new to the IVD industry don't really understand that there's that additional labeling requirements above normal medical devices. Because as we all know, IVDs are definitely nuanced medical devices and to have their own requirements to the user that are identified in that labeling standard, which is 21 CFR Part 809. And so this is just specifically for what's in the IFU and what's in the labels specific to IVD reagents, things like storage conditions and volumes, things you might not have in a normal medical device. So again, if you go back to ISO, and then you compare it to the new QMSR, FDA has added additional labeling requirements, mostly the UDI, but also some other things, because they feel, again, that ISO alone isn't enough for compliance. And so, again, you just have to take it as an IVD manufacturer and say, because I'm an IVD designer, I have to follow 21 CFR Part 809 as well, and it's just implied because of where you are in the IVD space.
And Kevin, from an implementation standpoint, labeling and packaging controls are an area where quality and regulatory often split ownership. How do you structure that so it holds up under an inspection?
Yeah, so in addition to quality and regulatory, there may be other folks involved, operations or quality control. The process for approving a label or changing a label is complex. There's the actual, regulatory certainly owns interpretation of the requirements and claims on the labels and instructions. Then quality may own the document control portion and versioning. Releasing that text, operations or QC may have to check that those things went through the printing process and came out looking the way that they were supposed to. So all of these processes need to be tied together. Oftentimes, I'll implement a separate change control process in the EQMS system just for labels because there's an approval of a proof, and then it goes to the printer, and then it comes back, and regulatory is involved with the earlier steps of that. And then there's a check on the operational or quality aspect at the end. So it's a pretty unique process and needs to be implemented in a special way. You can't just sort of shoehorn it into the normal change process typically. So I would encourage everyone to take a hard look at the actual steps in your process, especially if you're using outsourced printing, and to make sure that you've got each step checked. And, it's a risk analysis. Where can things go wrong, process FMEA wise, and then put in the correct controls around each of those steps. It's not complicated, but it's easy to have what you approved in regulatory not end up being what's on the printed label at the end if you're not careful about the process checks.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of different hands involved in the process. Then the fourth gap area is definitions and terminology. This one sounds almost administrative, but you flag it as a meaningful source of gap pain. Why is that?
This could be actually one of the hidden traps that you could fall into if you really don't do that detailed gap assessment. And the reason why is because all of the terminology, or a lot of the terminology of the old QSR is now disappeared. So I do know that, a lot of companies that started off complying to the quality system regulation and then went 1345, they still kept a lot of those FDA terms. Like, for example, things like a design history file doesn't exist anymore now. It's a medical device file. Design controls is design and development. Production and process controls is now production service provision. Instead of being able to reference now, a lot of companies would have those terms, but they would reference to the ISO provision, which was fine. But now those terms don't exist anymore. So that's just one of the things. So you really have to go through your procedures and make sure your terminology and your definitions are up to date.
Thanks, Dan. It's going to be hard for me to get DHF out of my lexicon transition over. So.
I know. It's hard for us old people, right?
I do think that FDA is going to have the same problem because it was their terminology too. So
yes.
I think there'll be a transition period, and you certainly need to map them and understand how crosswalk wise what references what. But they'll be struggling, and if you say DHF, that unless it's a brand new inspector, it's going to mean something to them as well.
Yeah, and I'll also add that a lot of companies get around that by having glossaries, right? And you can say a medical device file is the same as a design history file. So it's not like you don't have to change everything, but you do have to adjust it. And you're right, FDA is going to be on that curve too. So it's not like they're going to not give you a free pass for a while. But I think part of just recognizing it's a change is optics with that. So just something to look out for.
Yeah, the inspection side of the QMSR is where a lot of teams are caught off guard. QSIT is gone. Walk us through what CP 7382.850 changes and why it matters.
QSIT was primarily built on the main subunits that usually start around management responsibility, and you would go out from there. What changes now is it's really risk-based inspection. And so really they'll start with your product risk documents, your risk management plans, and then also be looking at what the actual risk of the product is in the field by looking right at your post-market data, your complaints in MDRs and things to see really if your risk management is basically working as well in their mind, because if you're having a lot of issues in the field, it isn't. So really it's driven now around the risk of the product, what you perceive as a risk and how well you've identified the risk, what your actual risk profile is in the field with users.
The other major change is records that were previously exempt under QSR 820.180C, management review records, quality audits, internal audits, and supplier audit reports. Those are now within FDA's inspectional authority. Kevin, you've been on both sides of this, hosting audits and conducting them. What does that change in how you would advise teams to write and maintain those documents?
So the biggest change is in mindset. I think folks used to sort of know that these were off limits and use that to give them a little bit of freedom in these things. The records should be written assuming that FDA is going to look at them. So that doesn't mean hiding problems or writing things really vaguely so it's hard to tell what happened. I think exactly the opposite. You should write them very clearly, factually, and professionally, certainly scoped tightly as you can. But if something's a systemic problem, you need to recognize that and deal with it within your QMS. Taking them sort of one at a time. For internal audits, that means making sure that your audits are, your findings are evidence-based. So just the way that you would if you've been through auditor training, not that, a general assessment of you're not documenting these things, but a very specific in batch record 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there was no calculation shown for step 5.2. Don't write general things, very specific to what exactly you found that's supported by the evidence that you reviewed in the audit. That makes things, there certainly is going to be an investigation in response to those audit observations. And if it gets wider, it gets wider. But, in terms of documenting the findings, just keep it very factual. Same with management reviews. I mean, what we're looking for, as we discussed earlier, is that the management's involved in the review. So if you're used to just having a very static slide deck with a signature at the bottom, doesn't change from review to review, that's not going to demonstrate that your management's involved and making decisions and reacting to the content of the review. So we want to see action items, meeting minutes, updates to quality objectives that are happening as a result of those review. That tells the inspector that the QMS is functioning, and it's these higher order concerns that the inspector should be looking at. Same with audit reports for suppliers. So So when you're looking at your supplier audits, are you really assessing them based on their risk and not just filling out a checklist? Everybody gets all fives and gets approved with a rubber stamp. You should be looking at what issues did we have with this supplier? How are we tying in supplier corrective actions? Really scoring them, especially for the ones that matter. And FDA knows who your critical suppliers are and which ones count. Apply the scrutiny to the ones that deserve it. Risk-based, that's the focus. That's how these things are intended to work. And you just need to apply your effort to the highest risk items and back it up with record keeping.
Dan, Kevin touched on how CP 7382.850 frames inspections around risk-based evidence decision-making. What should teams expect in how FDA will use risk management evidence during an inspection under the QMSR?
The primary goal of inspections now is really that the QMS meets FDA safety and effectiveness requirements, which has always been the case. But then next, they're basically doing it by looking at your risk management process, that it's in place, and that the company is using it to make risk-based decisions. And Kevin had a great example of how you can do that on the supplier side. So really everything, what he was saying about that your biggest concerns from a risk management perspective are really what you're spending your time on, are really what you're concerned about. And then where it is a lower risk thing and where you can show the issue is not going to affect safety and efficacy of your product, you're able to justify that through your risk management documentation. So it just hinges off of your risk management procedures and your risk management file that you are operating under really these risk controls, is then that FDA will look at things like your post-market data, but also your change control process. Because in your change control process, if it is a big change, you should be going back into your risk management documentation and really making sure that it was either addressed, or if it wasn't addressed, to make sure that you're always updating the risk profile of your device.
I mean, you've built and audited quality systems at IVD companies of different sizes. When you engage with a company and start looking at their QMS against U.S. regulatory requirements, what are the signs that there's more gap work ahead than they expect?
In general, it's a lack of clear integration of the U.S. regulatory oversight into the SOPs. So the SOP has been updated to include a statement that's something like notify regulatory for review or something, as opposed to the form actually having checkboxes for MDR assessment, rationale, things where the process has been updated to really guide you through compliance with the regulations, which is, how you want to do it. You want to have the process lead to compliance in a very natural way. If you're following your process, you're meeting the regulatory compliance instead of bolting it on with a couple of regulatory people who, if they're not involved in the day-to-day process and folks aren't trained appropriately, then there's going to be misses. So what I want to see is a tight integration of these specific FDA requirements into the SOPs. And then from a supplier control standpoint, it's a red flag if all suppliers are treated equally. And it's I think people used to get away with a supplier controls process that was a form of checkboxes with a score sheet that got filled in, and similar to management review, a very generic presentation with the right people in the room and signing off on some minutes. Those things are transparent to an auditor who's actually reading the review and seeing if you're making decisions. I always advocate at least quarterly management reviews or a lot of subsystem reviews that roll up to the management review. So you can't tell an FDA auditor that you're looking at trends once a year and expect them, it could be 11 months before you recognize a very serious problem. So there needs to be subsystems or sub-teams that are looking at these metrics and escalating them if they're not looked at regularly by the management team. And this can vary, significantly from different size companies, but that's the general idea, is integration and real functioning processes as opposed to checkboxes or SOPs having a minor update.
Dan, where do you see IVD manufacturers getting the QMSR transition wrong or oversimplifying it? What misconceptions come up most often?
I think we're just going to come full circle here. It basically is, again, because I'm ISO 1345, I don't need to do anything. And I think we've had enough points here today to say that there are nuances you have to be careful of. And what I encourage most people to do, and granted, this might be an insomnia cure for some people, but is really reading the preamble of the new quality system regulation just to be able to, or the QMSR, just to be able to really understand. I think with any new regulation, it's a good practice because then you really understand what FDA is concerned about in any new regulation, in this case, a transition to a industry standard. And it really comes down to what Kevin was saying is the integration of all the regulatory processes of the FDA into your quality system, but also just really making sure that you are giving FDA their share of acknowledgement in your international standards, right? As Kevin said, you might be selling to a lot of different spaces. If you're under MDSAP, you have to have all these different regulatory requirements in there, but you always have to give FDA its due and really pay attention to what they see as important on the compliance side.
I definitely always try and pay attention to what FDA wants. That's for sure. Dan and Kevin, thank you both. I think listeners at different points in the QMSR transition will each find something useful here. For listeners who want more detail, Dan's article on QMSR readiness for IVD manufacturers is available at DCNDx.com. If you need support with a QMSR gap assessment, independent auditing, remediation planning, or inspections readiness, you can reach DCN Dx's regulatory affairs team at dcndx.com/contact. Thanks for joining us for Expert Insights.